He stood in his office on the 42nd floor with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Manhattan skyline, and in his hands was a piece of paper that changed everything. The credit card statement. Numbers. Transactions. Dates. But what made him grip the desk and close his eyes wasn't the amount that had been spent. It was what it meant. 57 years old. $2.8 billion in the bank. 3 failed marriages. Children who barely called. A penthouse that echoed with silence. And for the first time in his entire life, Thomas Richardson understood that money had never bought him anything he actually needed. It had only shown him everything he was missing. 3 weeks earlier, Thomas had made a decision that seemed brilliant at the time. Powerful. A test, he'd called it. A way to see who people really were when no one was watching. He'd gathered 3 women. Completely different. Different backgrounds. Different ages. Different everything. And he'd given each of them something that most people would never touch in their lifetime. An unlimited black credit card. No limits. No restrictions. No questions asked. For 48 hours, he told them, I want you to spend whatever you want. Buy anything. Go anywhere. And then I'll know who you really are. Because money, he believed, tells the truth when nothing else will. Vivian was the first. Sophisticated. Columbia educated. Vice president at a luxury brand. The kind of woman who belonged in rooms full of important people. She'd smiled when he handed her the card. Not a thank you. Just a smile that said she'd been expecting this moment her entire life. Within 6 hours, she'd spent $87,000 on Cartier, Hermes, a designer wardrobe that required 3 separate shopping bags. She photographed it all and posted it to her private Instagram story. Manifest abundance, she'd written. But Thomas's security team noticed something else. Between the luxury purchases, she'd visited a cosmetic surgeon. A rhinoplasty booked for 2 weeks out. $15,000. She was investing in changing who she was. Then there was Jasmine, 26, influencer, 200,000 followers on Instagram. Everything about her screamed ambition, but it was the wrong kind. The kind that needed validation from strangers. She'd taken the card like it was a lottery ticket. Within hours, she was at 5-star hotels taking photos in luxury suites she'd rented for the afternoon just to get the Instagram content. She was buying limited edition sneakers, designer bags, jewelry, all of it strategically chosen to look expensive in photos. Thomas's team discovered that she'd bought expensive items, photographed them extensively on her phone, then returned them for refunds. She was building a brand on his money, creating a false version of herself for people who would never actually know her. But then there was Elena, the housekeeper, 54 years old. She'd cleaned his penthouse for 6 years. He barely noticed her. She'd always been there, quiet, efficient, invisible in the way that service people become invisible in the homes of the wealthy. When he told her about the test, she'd actually laughed. A real laugh. Not a nervous laugh. Not a grateful laugh. A genuine expression of amusement at the absurdity of what he was asking. She'd looked at him and asked a question that made him pause. What happens if I don't spend it? He'd smiled, thinking she was joking. But Elena wasn't joking. And what she did with that card over the next 48 hours was about to teach him a lesson he never saw coming. When Thomas pulled up Elena's credit card statement that morning, his hands were shaking. Not from anger. Not from disappointment with the amount. He was shaking because for the first time, he realized that Elena had spent every single dollar with intention. With love. With a kind of wisdom that couldn't be taught or bought. The first transaction, $1,200 at a medical clinic. His investigators traced it. Her daughter, the granddaughter, needed orthodontic work. Elena had paid for it. Just like that. No annoncement. No acknowledgement. Just a quiet act of a woman trying to fix her family's problems. Then $8,000 at a construction company that went directly to her mother's house. The house where Elena had grown up. The roof had needed repair for 3 years. The windows were rotting. The electrical system was ancient and dangerous. Elena had never asked Thomas for help. She just worked, saved money from her paychecks, suffered through a house that was literally falling apart. But with his card, she didn't hesitate. She fixed her mother's home. She made her mother safe. The transactions continued like a map of her heart. $5,000 to a local youth mentorship program. Just donated. No tax write-off. No recognition. just a quiet woman trying to give back to the community that had raised her. She bought groceries for the food bank, not random items. She read the nutritional labels and carefully selected foods that malnourished families actually needed. She bought gifts, a watch for her ex-husband because they'd stayed on good terms, a leather jacket for her son because she knew he wanted one but couldn't afford it, books for her grandchildren, each gift wrapped in tissue paper with handwritten notes. And when Thomas added up all of Elena's purchases, he discovered something that stopped him cold. In 48 hours, with access to unlimited money, Elena Santos had not spent a single dollar on herself. Not one. His hands trembled as he held that statement, because he finally understood what he'd been missing his entire life. He had $2.8 billion, and he'd never learned what Elena knew instinctively. That the point of having money wasn't to show people who you were. It was to help people become who they needed to be. And standing there in his office, looking out at the Manhattan skyline, Thomas Richardson realized that the richest man in the building was the poorest man in the world. He walked to the window, pressed his hand against the glass, and he cried. Not because of what Vivian had done, not because of what Jasmine had done, but because what Elena had done showed him that he'd spent his entire life building walls when what he actually needed was a door. Before we dive deeper into what happened next, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming stories. Because what happens when Thomas brings all three women back to face what they've done is going to challenge everything you think you know about money, about character, and about what it really means to be human. Stay with us. So who is Thomas Richardson really? That's the question we need to answer if we're going to understand why this moment, standing in his office with Elena's credit card statement trembling in his hands, would change the trajectory of his entire life. Because you need to know that Thomas wasn't some heartless billionaire who'd built his empire on the backs of others. He was something far more complicated. He was a man who'd sacrificed everything to build something, only to discover that what he'd built had no room for him in it. Thomas had started from nothing. His father was a factory worker in Queens. His mother was a nurse who worked double shifts. They lived paycheck to paycheck in a small apartment where the walls were thin enough that you could hear the neighbors arguing, and the radiator clanked all night long in the winter. By the time Thomas was 14, he was working summers to help pay the rent. He'd mow lawns. He'd wash cars. He'd do anything to put money on the kitchen table. His parents loved him. They'd tell him he was special, that he could be anything he wanted. But they were also terrified for him, terrified that he'd end up like them, working their entire lives and never getting ahead, living paycheck to paycheck in an apartment where the walls were thin. Thomas made a decision when he was young that would define everything that came after. He was going to get out. He was going to build something, and he was never going to be poor again. By the time he was 20, he dropped out of college, much to his parents' horror, and he was flipping properties in the outer boroughs of New York City. His first deal was a condemned building in Brooklyn that he bought for $50,000. He renovated it with his own hands, working nights and weekends while his friends were out partying. He sold it 18 months later for $140,000, a profit of $90,000. That single deal changed his mind about what was possible. He wasn't going to get rich working for someone else. He wasn't going to climb some corporate ladder where the people at the top kept the money for themselves. He was going to build his own ladder, and he was going to own every single rung. For the next 25 years, Thomas applied the same principle over and over. He'd see something that others couldn't see. He'd see potential in a broken building, a struggling business, a neighborhood that was about to transform. He'd invest before everyone else figured it out. And then, when the value exploded, he'd be the one walking away with the money. By the time he turned 45, Thomas Richardson was a billionaire. Not just wealthy, not just rich, a billionaire. The kind of number that most people can't even comprehend. $2.8 billion. Enough money to buy anything, go anywhere, do anything. But here's what nobody tells you about becoming that successful that quickly. The cost isn't just financial. The cost is everything else. Thomas's first marriage ended when he was 32. Her name was Catherine. She was beautiful and smart, and she loved him when he was nobody. But as Thomas got richer, something changed. Catherine started asking him questions about where he was going, who he was meeting with, why he was working until 3 in the morning. Thomas told her she was being paranoid. He was building something important, something that would secure their future. Catherine didn't care about the future. She cared about the present. She cared that her husband was never home, that when he was home, he was thinking about the next deal, that the man she married was disappearing into his own ambition. The divorce was ugly. Catherine got a settlement of $5 million, which Thomas barely noticed because he made $5 million in a few weeks. She took half of what they built together, but Thomas got the empire. And he told himself that was the better deal. He told himself that money was more important than a marriage, that the empire was worth the sacrifice. His second marriage lasted longer. 7 years. Her name was Michelle. She was a socialite, the kind of woman who belonged at charity galas and high-end restaurants. Thomas married her because she fit into his life. She understood the world he lived in. She understood that money was the language they spoke. But Michelle also understood that money could be extracted. She started asking him for things: access to accounts, control of investments. She wanted to know exactly how much he was worth because she wanted to know exactly how much she was entitled to. Thomas started to notice financial irregularities, money moving to accounts he didn't recognize. Michelle was smart. She was also greedy. When he finally confronted her about it, she admitted that she'd been trying to secure her financial future in case he left her. She was hedging her bets, protecting herself. And in a strange way, Thomas understood. Everyone around him was trying to extract value. Why should his wife be any different? The divorce cost him $20 million. Again, barely a dent in his fortune. By the time Thomas was in his 50s, he'd been married 3 times. His first 2 marriages had ended in legal battles over money. His third marriage, to a woman named Patricia, had ended when she confessed that she'd never actually loved him. She'd married him because he was rich, because her father had died and left her nothing, and she needed someone to take care of her. She'd been honest about it, which Thomas almost respected. At least she wasn't pretending. But the honesty didn't make the loneliness any easier. His children from his first marriage barely called. His son from his second marriage saw him once a year on his birthday, and they'd have dinner together that felt more like a business meeting than a family gathering. His stepchildren from his third marriage had contested the divorce settlement so aggressively that Thomas had hired lawyers just to get them out of his life. And now, at 57 years old, Thomas Richardson had everything except the one thing that actually mattered. He had no one who cared about him for who he was. Everyone cared about what he had. Everyone wanted access to his money, his power, his connections. No one wanted access to him. This was the empty penthouse, the sleepless nights, the endless scrolling through social media at 3 in the morning, watching other people with their families, their friends, their lovers, wondering what it felt like to be loved for something other than your net worth. Thomas had hired therapists. He tried meditation. He considered buying a yacht just to have something to do with his time. But nothing filled the void. And then one evening, at 3 in the morning, Thomas was lying in bed in his 42nd floor penthouse, unable to sleep as usual, and he stumbled across a TED Talk on his phone. The speaker was a woman named Brené Brown, and she was talking about authenticity, about the danger of building walls so high that no one could get in, about the difference between connection and transaction. And something in those words struck Thomas like a physical blow. He realized that he'd spent 57 years building walls. Financial walls, emotional walls, walls designed to keep people out because he decided long ago that people couldn't be trusted, that everyone had an angle, that love was a transaction like everything else. At 3 in the morning, Thomas made a decision. It was impulsive. It was probably stupid, but it felt like the only honest thing he'd done in decades. He was going to test this theory. He was going to find 3 women from completely different backgrounds. He was going to give each of them access to unlimited money for 48 hours. And he was going to see what they really valued. Because if money tells the truth, if it really does show you who people are when no one's watching, then maybe one of these women would show him something real. Maybe one of them would care about something other than wealth and status and power. Maybe one of them would show him that authentic connection was still possible in a world built on transactions. The next morning, Thomas called his assistant. He didn't explain himself. He just gave her the criteria. 3 women, different ages, different backgrounds, different everything. Tell them you're recruiting for a new position on the foundation board. Tell them there's a consulting fee, but there's one real test, a test that will determine who gets the job and who gets something far more valuable. His assistant, a woman named Margaret who'd worked for Thomas for 15 years, gave him a look that said she thought he was losing his mind. But Margaret was nothing if not efficient. Within a week, she'd found the 3 women. The first was Vivian Hart, 32 years old, senior vice president at a luxury brand, Columbia MBA, the kind of resume that looked like a checklist of every achievement that mattered in New York society. The second was Jasmine Wu, 26 years old, dancer turned influencer, 200,000 followers on Instagram. The kind of girl who understood that life was currency and followers were the new wealth. And the third was Elena Santos, 54 years old, Thomas's housekeeper, the woman who'd been cleaning his penthouse for 6 years, the woman who he barely noticed because she was so quiet, so efficient, so completely unobtrusive that she'd become invisible. Thomas reviewed the files that Margaret had prepared. He looked at their photographs. He looked at their social media profiles. He looked at their employment histories. And then he made the appointment for all 3 of them to come to his office on the same day, though they didn't know about each other. He was going to give each of them the black card. He was going to tell them the same story, and then he was going to wait and see what they did with it. The first woman to arrive was Vivian Hart. Thomas watched her walk into his office from the 42nd floor, and he immediately understood why she'd risen so quickly in her career. She had presence. She had the kind of confidence that made you believe she'd belong anywhere. She was dressed impeccably. Her hair was perfect. Her makeup was flawless. And there was something in her eyes that Thomas recognized immediately because he saw it in his own mirror every morning. Hunger. Vivian Hart was hungry for something, and Thomas didn't think it was a foundation board position. He stood to greet her, and they shook hands. Her grip was firm, but not aggressive. Her smile was warm, but calculated. She was good. She'd practiced being good at this. Thomas explained the test without going into details. He told her that he was looking for someone to help him with his foundation, someone who understood values, someone who could help him figure out what he actually wanted to accomplish with his wealth. And then he said the words that made Vivian's eyes widen slightly. I want to give you a test. Take this card. Unlimited access. 48 hours. Spend whatever you want. At the end, I'll give one of you something far more valuable than money. Vivian took the card from his hand. It was black. It was heavy. It felt like power in physical form. And Thomas watched her face as she held it. There was a flicker of something across her expression. Just a moment. But in that moment, Thomas saw what Vivian really was. She was a woman who'd spent her entire life climbing the corporate ladder, climbing the social ladder, investing in herself because no one else was going to. And the card represented another rung on that ladder. She smiled at Thomas. Thank you, she said. This is a wonderful opportunity. I promise you, I'll show you what I'm capable of. And then she left. Thomas watched her go, and he knew exactly what Vivian Hart was going to do with that card. She was going to invest in Vivian Hart. The second woman to arrive was Jasmine Wu. She burst into his office like she was arriving at a party, not a job interview. She was beautiful in a completely different way than Vivian. Where Vivian was elegant and controlled, Jasmine was vibrant and unrestrained. She wore designer clothes, but wore them like they were costumes, like she was playing a character in a movie about a rich girl's life. She had the kind of energy that made you think she'd been drinking coffee for the past 4 hours, or maybe she was just young enough that life felt like an adventure instead of a series of transactions. Thomas explained the same test to Jasmine. Take the card. 48 hours. Spend whatever you want. Show me what you value. And Jasmine's reaction was completely different from Vivian's. She actually squealed. She actually jumped up and down. Oh my God, she said. This is so cool. Like, this is literally a dream. I don't even know where to start. Thomas found himself smiling despite himself. Jasmine's enthusiasm was genuine, even if her values were completely transparent. She was going to use the card to build her brand. to create content, to show her followers that she was the kind of girl who could access unlimited money and unlimited luxury. She was going to turn his generosity into social currency, and she didn't even have the self-awareness to hide it. She was honest to her dishonesty. The third woman to arrive was Elena Santos. She walked into his office like she was entering a room she wasn't supposed to be in. She was wearing her normal clothes, the same clothes she wore every day to clean his penthouse. Simple, practical, colorless. She looked uncomfortable standing in his office, surrounded by his expensive art and his leather furniture and his floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan. She looked like she wanted to apologize for taking up space. Thomas stood to greet her, and for the first time, he felt something shift in his chest. Not attraction, something deeper. Recognition, maybe, or just the simple acknowledgement that Elena was the only person in this entire building who didn't want something from him. She wanted nothing. She was entirely content to remain invisible. Thomas explained the test to Elena the same way he'd explained it to Vivian and Jasmine. Take the card. Unlimited access. 48 hours. Show me what you value. And Elena did something that neither Vivian nor Jasmine had done. She asked a question. What happens if I don't spend it? Thomas laughed. It was a genuine laugh. It came from somewhere deep inside him where laughter rarely lived anymore. Elena, he said, I'm giving you unlimited access to my money. What would you do with it? Elena looked at the card for a long moment. Then she looked at Thomas, and she said something that he would remember for the rest of his life. She said, I'd have to think about it, because spending money that isn't mine would feel like stealing, even if you said it was okay. The experiment began on a Thursday morning. Thomas had given each woman the same instructions. 48 hours. Friday and Saturday. Do whatever you want. A car would be available. Security would track basic movements for safety, but otherwise, they were free. He told them he'd review what they purchased on Sunday. He didn't tell them that his security team was monitoring every single transaction, every purchase, every location, building a complete profile of who each woman really was when they thought no one was paying attention. Vivian's first stop was Cartier on Fifth Avenue. Within 90 minutes, she'd purchased a diamond bracelet for $35,000. The bracelet was beautiful. It was the kind of bracelet that made a statement. It said, I have money. I have taste. I belong here. She wore it out of the store and immediately started taking photographs. Selfies with the bracelet prominently displayed. Photos of her wrist at expensive restaurants. Photos of her in luxury hotel lobbies with the bracelet catching the light. She posted them to her private Instagram story with captions like, treating myself and manifesting abundance. And Thomas's security team watched and documented every single moment. From Cartier, Vivian went to Hermes. She spent $12,000 on a handbag, not because she needed a handbag. She had dozens of handbags. She spent $12,000 because the bag was limited edition and because carrying an Hermes bag was a status symbol. From Hermes, she went to Saks Fifth Avenue. She spent another $30,000 on designer clothes. A dress from Saint Laurent, a jacket from Alexander McQueen, a cashmere sweater from Chanel. Each piece was carefully selected. Each piece was designed to make her look a certain way, to broadcast a certain message about who she was. By the end of Friday, Vivian had spent $134,000, and she'd done it all in the same neighborhood in Manhattan. She was creating a version of herself that looked like money. She was becoming the kind of woman that she'd always wanted to be. Or at least, she was becoming the kind of woman that she thought she was supposed to be. But Thomas's security team noticed something that Vivian didn't realize was being documented. On Saturday morning, Vivian visited a cosmetic surgeon's office on the Upper East Side. She spent 40 minutes inside. When she came out, she had a booking confirmation in her purse. A rhinoplasty, $15,000, scheduled for 2 weeks. Vivian Hart was going to change her nose. She was investing in the improvement of her physical form. She was literally redesigning herself with Thomas's money. And she was doing it so quickly, so naturally, that she barely seemed to think about it. The cosmetic work was just another purchase. Another investment in the Vivian Hart brand. By the time Saturday ended, Vivian had spent $237,000, nearly $250,000. Every single dollar spent on herself. Every single purchase designed to make her look better, feel richer, seem more successful. There was not a single transaction that benefited anyone else. There was not a single moment where Vivian Hart thought about anyone but Vivian Hart. Jasmine's experience was completely different. She started by researching experiences rather than things. She booked a weekend at an exclusive private island resort in the Caribbean. $56,000 for 2 nights. The resort was the kind of place where billionaires went when they wanted to disappear. The kind of place where privacy was guaranteed and luxury was assumed. Jasmine flew down on Friday morning, spent the day photographing the resort, the beach, the sunset, the infinity pool that blended into the ocean. She photographed herself in designer swimwear. She photographed her cocktails. She photographed the private cabana where she was staying. Everything was carefully framed. Everything was designed to create the impression that Jasmine Wu was the kind of girl who lived this life, that this was normal for her, that she belonged in places like this. But Thomas's security team discovered something troubling. Jasmine had a pattern. She would visit high-end boutiques. She would spend hours trying on items. She would photograph herself wearing expensive jewelry, expensive watches, expensive handbags. And then, 2 hours later, she would return to the same store and demand a refund. She wasn't buying these items to own them. She was buying them to photograph them. She was using Thomas's money to create content, to build her brand, to convince 200,000 Instagram followers that she was the kind of girl who could afford luxury. She was extracting value from his wealth to resell it as authenticity to people who would never actually know her. By the time Saturday ended, Jasmine had spent $142,000. But nearly half of it had been returned. She'd created an illusion of wealth and privilege based entirely on temporary access to Thomas Richardson's money. She wasn't building a life. She was building a persona. And then there was Elena. Elena took the card and drove directly to the neighborhood where her daughter lived. She didn't go shopping. She went to a medical clinic. She'd been there before, but only to look at the paperwork. Her grandson needed orthodontic work. The boy was 11 years old, and his teeth were severely crooked. The family didn't have insurance that covered cosmetic dental work. Elena's daughter made decent money, but she was a single mother with 2 kids, and every dollar went toward rent and food and utilities. The orthodontic work had been on hold. It had been a distant dream, something they get around to eventually when there was money. Elena paid the down payment, $1,200. Her daughter answered the phone when the clinic called to confirm a payment, and she burst into tears. She didn't ask Elena where the money came from. She knew better. Her mother had been saving every dollar from her housekeeping job. Her mother had been sacrificing. And now, somehow, impossibly, her grandson would get his teeth fixed. Elena didn't need thanks. She just needed to know that her family was okay. From her daughter's neighborhood, Elena drove to her mother's house. The house where she'd grown up. The house that had been falling apart for the past 3 years. The roof had a leak that Elena had been trying to patch with tarps and hope. The windows were rotting. The electrical system was ancient and dangerous. Elena had mentioned it to Thomas once, very casually, when she thought he wasn't really listening. She'd said something like, "My mother's house needs some work." She'd said it the way you say that the weather's nice. Just making conversation. Not asking for help. Not expecting anything. Thomas hadn't responded. He just nodded. But Elena's comment had stuck with him somehow. He'd thought about it more than once. He'd wondered what it would be like to live in a house that was literally falling apart. To not have the money to fix it. To just live with the decay. Elena hired a contractor with Thomas's card. She approved the work. A new roof. Fixed windows. Updated electrical systems. Insulation. Fresh paint. Over the course of Friday and Saturday, her mother's house transformed from a place that was barely holding together into a home that would last another generation. Her mother stood in the living room on Saturday afternoon, tears streaming down her face, and she asked Elena the same question that she'd been asking for 3 years. "Where did you get the money for this?" And Elena told her the truth. "I worked for someone generous. I took a test, and I passed by learning that the most important things in life have nothing to do with money." $8,000 had transformed her mother's life. It hadn't made her rich, but had made her safe. From her mother's house, Elena made another stop, a community center in her neighborhood. She'd volunteered there for years, during her days off, helping kids with their homework. The center was always struggling for funding. They didn't have enough resources. They couldn't pay their staff what they deserved. Elena walked in and asked what they needed most. The director, a man named David who'd known Elena for 5 years, listed off 100 things. New computers, expanded programming, better lighting, more staff. Elena donated $5,000 and asked only that they use it where it was needed most. She didn't ask for recognition. She didn't ask for her name on a plaque. She didn't even ask for a tax write-off. She just walked in and made a donation and walked out. Elena then spent the rest of her time visiting different stores, not to buy luxury items for herself, but to carefully select products for the food bank. She read nutritional labels. She bought proteins and vegetables and fruits and whole grains. She bought things that malnourished families actually needed to eat. She spent $400 stocking the food bank with real nutrition instead of cheap processed food. And then she went shopping for gifts. A watch for her ex-husband. They'd been divorced for 8 years, but they'd managed to stay on good terms. He was remarried now, and he had a stepdaughter who was struggling in school, and her ex-husband had been nothing but supportive when Elena wanted to be involved in the girl's life. The watch was quality. It would last a lifetime. It said, "I respect you. I appreciate you. I see you." From there, Elena bought a leather jacket for her son. She'd heard him mention it once. A jacket he wanted but couldn't afford. She bought it. She also bought books for her grandchildren. Not expensive books, just books that she thought they'd enjoy. Books about adventure and discovery and possibility. And she wrapped each gift in tissue paper and wrote handwritten notes. Not typed notes. Handwritten. Personal. From her heart. By the time Elena's 48 hours were over, she'd spent $48,000. And she'd done it without spending a single dollar on herself. Sunday morning, Thomas sat in his office before dawn. He couldn't sleep. He'd been awake all night, waiting for this moment. Margaret had sent him the complete statements from each woman's credit card. 3 separate narratives. 3 separate versions of what people value when they think no one's watching and money is no object. Thomas started with Vivian's statement. $237,000. Cartier, Hermes, Saks, a cosmetic surgeon. Every single line item designed to improve Vivian's appearance or social status or perceived wealth. Thomas could see the progression. He could see Vivian becoming more and more herself with each purchase. A self that she'd been constructing her entire life. A self that required constant investment and constant maintenance. Thomas felt something that surprised him. He felt sad, not angry, sad, because Vivian Hart was going to spend her entire life trying to become someone worthy of love, and she was never going to realize that the person she was trying to become didn't exist. Then Thomas looked at Jasmine's statement. $142,000 spent. But the more Thomas looked at it, the more he realized how much of it was illusory. Jasmine had purchased and returned. Purchased and returned. She bought experiences specifically to photograph them. She'd created a lifestyle that was entirely performance. There was no authenticity in Jasmine's purchases. There was only strategy. Only the calculation of how to extract maximum value from temporary access to wealth. Thomas felt something different with Jasmine's statement. He felt used. He felt like he'd been part of a transaction. He'd given Jasmine money, and she'd used it to build her brand. She'd used his wealth as a prop in her social media performance. And then Thomas looked at Elena's statement. $48,000. The most specific, the most intentional, the most completely devoid of self-interest transactions he'd ever seen. $1,200 for his daughter's orthodontia. $8,000 for his mother's house repairs. $5,000 donated to the community center. $400 for the food bank. The rest distributed as gifts to family members. And $0 spent on Elena Santos. Not one transaction for herself. Thomas held the paper, and he realized something that made his hands shake. Elena had spent his money the way he spent his money, with calculation and strategy. But instead of calculating how to improve herself, Elena had calculated how to help everyone else. Instead of building her own empire, Elena had quietly built a safety net for everyone she loved. Thomas called his assistant Margaret into his office. He didn't explain himself. He just said, I want to meet with all three of them. Tomorrow. Together. I want them to see what the others did. Margaret looked at him with an expression that said she still thought he was losing his mind. But she scheduled the meeting. The next day, all three women sat in Thomas Richardson's office. Vivian looking confident and gorgeous. Jasmine looking bubbly and excited. Elena looking uncomfortable and out of place. Thomas sat across from them. He didn't smile. He didn't explain. He just turned on the large monitor on his wall, and he pulled up the first credit card statement. Vivian's statement. Every purchase visible. The diamond bracelet. The Hermes bag. The designer clothes. The cosmetic surgeon. $237,000. And then he looked at Vivian and he asked a simple question. Why? Vivian's face went white. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Finally, she said something about confidence, about showing him that she could handle money responsibly, about believing in herself. But her voice wavered. She knew how it sounded. She knew what the statement revealed about her. Before she could finish, Thomas pulled up the next statement. Jasmine's. The boutique purchases and returns. The resort photographs. The brand-building strategy. $142,000 spent to create the illusion of a life she didn't actually live. And Jasmine became defensive immediately. She talked about building her platform, about influencer economics, about understanding the market. But Thomas cut her off. He showed her the specific returns, the items purchased and immediately refunded. And Jasmine's face flushed with embarrassment because she suddenly understood how it looked. She'd been caught trying to extract value from his generosity. And then Thomas pulled up Elena's statement. $48,000. Every transaction organized chronologically. $1,200 for orthodontia. $8,000 for home repairs. $5,000 for community center. $400 for food bank. Gifts. More gifts. And nothing for Elena Santos. Not a single dollar for herself. The room went silent. Thomas watched the three women. Vivian was looking away. Jasmine was scrolling on her phone, defensive, unwilling to acknowledge what she was seeing. But Elena was crying, not from sadness, but from seeing her own choices reflected back at her, seeing every dollar accounted for, seeing her entire life distilled into $48,000 of pure love. Thomas stood up. He looked at Vivian Hart and he said, "You're fired. Return the items. The card is being canceled." Vivian opened her mouth to protest. But Thomas held up his hand. "I gave you unlimited money, and you spent it all on yourself. That's not evil. That's human. That's what most people do. But it's not what I was looking for." Vivian left the office, and Thomas heard her heels clicking down the hallway. He looked at Jasmine Wu, and he said the same thing. "You're fired. Return the items. The card is being canceled. But before you go, I want you to understand something. You came here pretending to be grateful, but you were extracting value. You came here pretending to be authentic, but you were building a persona. There's nothing wrong with that. You're young. You're figuring out who you are. But you used my money to do it. And I didn't give you this card to become content. I gave it to you to show me who you really are." Jasmine left without saying anything. And then Thomas was alone with Elena Santos. He looked at her, and he asked a question that he'd been thinking about since he read her statement. Why? Why would you have access to unlimited money and spend nothing on yourself? Elena was quiet for a long moment. She was still crying. She wiped her eyes with her sleeve. And then she spoke. She said something that Thomas would remember for the rest of his life. She said, "Because having less taught me what matters. You have more money than you could spend in 100 lifetimes. And you're still empty. I have very little. And I'm not empty. I know how to love people. I know how to take care of people. I know how to give. And you gave me money to spend, so I spent it on the people I love. That's what matters. Not the money. The love." Thomas was quiet. Really quiet. The kind of quiet that comes when you finally understand something about yourself that you've been avoiding for your entire life. And then he did something that he hadn't planned to do. He made Elena an offer that would change both of their lives forever. Thomas looked at Elena, and he said something that he'd been planning to say since the moment he finished reading her credit card statement. He said, "I want you to leave your housekeeping job. I want you to manage my foundation. We're going to help families like yours. We're going to use this money to change lives. You'll be paid $250,000 a year, and I'm giving you $1 million for your family. No strings attached. Elena's face went white. She looked at the check that Thomas slid across the desk. $1 million. $1 million. She'd earned approximately $2 million in her entire lifetime of work, and Thomas was handing her half of that in a single check. She started crying again. Not delicate tears. Not the kind of crying that comes from gratitude. Real crying. The kind that comes from being overwhelmed by a truth you've been avoiding your entire life. Thomas thought she was crying because he'd helped her. He thought she was crying because her problems were solved. But Elena was crying for a different reason entirely. She was crying because she suddenly understood what she'd done. For 6 years, Elena had worked in Thomas Richardson's penthouse. She'd cleaned his floors. She'd cooked his meals. She'd organized his closets. She'd listened to his problems without ever sharing her own. She'd made herself so small, so quiet, so completely unobtrusive that Thomas had barely noticed she existed. And in all those years, she'd never asked for help. Not once. She'd never mentioned that her mother's house was falling apart. She'd never mentioned that her grandson needed braces. She'd never mentioned that the community center where she volunteered was struggling for resources. She just suffered in silence and worked harder and saved more and sacrificed more. And when Thomas gave her the credit card, she didn't spend it on herself, because spending it on herself would have felt like betraying everything she'd been taught about her place in the world. Her place was to serve. Her place was to help. Her place was to sacrifice. So when Thomas gave her unlimited money, her instinct wasn't to enjoy it. Her instinct was to use it to prove her worth by proving how much she loved everyone else. Elena had spent $48,000 trying to earn the right to exist, trying to prove that she was a good daughter, trying to prove that she was a good mother, trying to prove that she deserved the oxygen she was breathing. And Thomas, without realizing it, had just rewarded that behavior by offering her a job and $1 million. He'd looked at Elena's choices, and he'd seen virtue. But Elena was looking at her own choices, and she was seeing something more complicated. She was seeing patterns. She was seeing survival mechanisms. She was seeing the ways in which poverty creates obligation. She was seeing how people without money learn to justify their own existence by making themselves useful to people with it. 2 months into Elena's new role at the foundation, something shifted. Elena had stopped being the quiet housekeeper and had started becoming something more visible, more vocal. And with that visibility came a kind of honesty that Thomas wasn't prepared for. Elena started asking him difficult questions. Hard questions. Questions like, why do you give so much money away now, but couldn't give time to your family when they needed you most? Why do you feel like you need to buy redemption? Why do you think offering me a job and $1 million absolves you of anything? Thomas didn't have good answers to these questions because the answers were complicated. The answers involved looking at himself in ways he didn't want to look. Elena continued. She said, my daughter has a good life now. My mother's house is fixed, but my son still doesn't trust me because I chose work over being present. The money I spent on them was apology money. I was trying to make up for absence with gifts, just like you're trying to do now. You want to save me with your money because you think money is the universal solution. But I don't need to be saved. I need to be seen. Thomas realized something uncomfortable that afternoon. Elena's selflessness with the credit card wasn't evidence of her virtue. It was evidence of her wounds. It was the behavior of a woman who'd learned, over 54 years, that her own needs didn't matter, that her own desires were secondary to everyone else's survival, that the most valuable thing she could do was disappear into service. And when Thomas offered her a job and $1 million, he wasn't liberating her. He was just repositioning her in the same power dynamic. She was his enlightened servant now instead of his regular one. He was still the man with the power. She was still the woman without it. The money had changed her circumstances, but it hadn't changed the fundamental dynamic of their relationship. Elena asked Thomas a question that made him sit with his discomfort. She asked, did you ever think about asking me what I actually wanted? Not assuming, not deciding, not offering solutions, just asking. Thomas realized that he hadn't. He'd seen Elena's credit card statement. He'd made assumptions about who she was based on her choices. He decided that she was virtuous and selfless and deserving of reward. But he'd never asked her what she actually wanted her life to look like. He'd never asked her what her dreams were beyond taking care of everyone else. He'd never asked her what she wanted to become. He just looked at her, and he decided who she was and what she deserved. Elena told Thomas something that he needed to hear. She said, "I spent $48,000 trying to prove that I was worthy of existing. And you're trying to spend the rest of your life trying to prove that you're worthy of being loved. Neither of us is going to find what we're looking for with money, because love isn't something you can buy. It's something you have to learn to accept." Over the next year, Elena didn't quit her job at the foundation, but she changed how she did it. She started saying no to extra hours. She started taking vacations with her grandchildren. She started investing in her own education instead of everyone else's survival. She started, very slowly, learning to put herself first without feeling guilty about it. And Thomas watched this transformation, and he realized something about himself. He'd spent 57 years running from emptiness by running toward accomplishment, by building empires, by accumulating wealth, by trying to prove that he deserved to exist by achieving more than everyone around him. And it had never worked. The emptiness had never gone away. It had just gotten bigger, because you can't run away from emptiness. You have to turn around and face it. And face it, Thomas finally started to do. 3 years after the credit card experiment, Thomas Richardson's life looked completely different on the surface, but was fundamentally the same underneath. Elena Santos was still working at his foundation. She made $250,000 a year. Her family's financial problems were solved. Her mother lived in a house that wouldn't fall apart. Her daughter's son had perfect teeth. Her grandson had gone to a better school. Her family was secure in ways they never would have been without Thomas's intervention. On paper, Elena's life had been transformed by a billionaire's generosity. And in many ways, it had been. But here's what Thomas learned, and what he wanted everyone to understand. Money solves financial problems. It doesn't solve psychological ones. 3 years into her new life, Elena still worked 60-hour weeks, even though she didn't need to. She still asked permission before taking time off. She still felt guilty spending money on herself. She still referred to her paycheck as the money Thomas gave me rather than the money I earned. She still acted like she was supposed to be grateful for the opportunity to exist. The poverty mentality didn't disappear when the money arrived. It didn't evaporate because someone powerful had decided she was worthy. It lingered. It infected. It created patterns that were decades old and wouldn't be undone by a single act of generosity, no matter how generous. Elena was happier, yes. Her life was objectively better, but she wasn't saved. No amount of money could undo 30 years of survival mode thinking. No amount of money could undo the years of making herself small so that other people could be comfortable. Thomas understood something that changed how he approached his foundation entirely. He understood that generosity without understanding doesn't liberate. It just perpetuates the same power dynamics in a nicer package. When you give someone money, you're not saving them. You're just solving the immediate problem while leaving the deeper wound untouched. So Thomas changed his foundation's approach. He stopped giving away money like a savior dispensing charity. He started engaging with communities like a partner, trying to understand what they actually needed. He sat in people's homes. He listened to their stories. He asked questions. He resisted the urge to immediately solve their problems with cash, because he'd learned that money was the easiest solution and usually the wrong one. The right solution required getting uncomfortable. It required sitting with people in their struggle instead of trying to rescue them from it. Vivian Hart's story took a different trajectory. She got her rhinoplasty. The cosmetic surgery was successful. She looked the way she'd always wanted to look. And for about 6 months, she felt better. She felt more confident. She felt like she'd finally become the version of herself that she was supposed to be. But then something shifted. She realized that changing her nose didn't change anything fundamental about her. The hunger was still there. The need to climb was still there. The feeling that she wasn't enough was still there. So she started looking for the next thing to fix. The next investment. The next self-improvement project. Within 3 years, Vivian Hart had spent over $500,000 on cosmetic procedures. Rhinoplasty, breast augmentation, liposuction, Botox, fillers, laser treatments. Each procedure was supposed to be the thing that would finally make her feel worthy. Each one left her emptier than before. She'd climbed so high in her career that she was now a senior executive, but she was also the kind of senior executive who spent her lunch breaks getting injections. She was the kind of person who looked beautiful but never felt beautiful. She was the kind of person who had everything and felt like she had nothing. Jasmine Wu's story was the opposite, but somehow the same. Her influencer career peaked about 18 months after the credit card experiment. She'd leveraged the content she'd created during her 48 hours with Thomas's money into a sponsorship deal with a luxury brand. She became a brand ambassador. She was making good money. Her follower count was growing. Everything was working exactly the way she'd planned. But the algorithm changed. The market shifted. There were 10,000 girls just like Jasmine, all trying to build the same brand, all fighting for the same followers, all desperate to convince the world that they lived a lifestyle they couldn't actually afford. Jasmine's relevance faded. By 3 years out, she was desperately chasing validation from an audience that had moved on. She was still trying to maintain the persona that she'd created with Thomas's money, but the money was gone. The access was gone. And without it, the persona was exposed as the illusion it had always been. Jasmine Wu learned that you can build an empire on borrowed wealth, but eventually, the loan comes due. Thomas had periodic contact with both Vivian and Jasmine over the 3-year period. He'd check in. He'd see how they were doing. And he was struck by how little the money had actually changed anything for either of them. Vivian was still chasing a version of herself that she could never become. Jasmine was still trying to convince people that she was something she wasn't. Neither of them had learned anything from the credit card experiment. Neither of them had experienced anything that shifted their fundamental understanding of what matters. Because they both walked into that experiment already convinced that money was the solution. And when Thomas gave them money, he just confirmed what they already believed. Meanwhile, Elena had actually changed. Not because of the money, but because of the questions that the money had forced her to ask herself. What do I value? Who am I when no one's watching? What would I choose if I had the freedom to choose? Thomas continued his foundation work, and he understood that the people in his foundation didn't need to be saved. They needed systems to change. They needed power structures to shift. They needed access and opportunity and respect. Money could buy some of those things, but it couldn't buy all of them. And trying to solve structural problems with individual wealth was just another way of avoiding the real work. 3 years after the credit card experiment, Thomas Richardson was a different man. Not because he'd had an epiphany, not because he'd suddenly become humble or generous or enlightened, but because he'd sat with Elena in her honesty and he'd been forced to confront something about himself that he'd been avoiding his entire life. He'd spent 57 years building walls. Emotional walls, financial walls, walls designed to keep people out because he decided that people couldn't be trusted, that everyone had an angle, that love was a transaction. And sitting with Elena's truth had forced him to wonder if maybe he was the one who had the angle. Maybe he was the one making everything a transaction. Maybe his generosity was just another form of control. Maybe his wealth was just another wall. And that realization, that uncomfortable, devastating realization, was more valuable than any amount of money could have been. Here's what I want you to understand about this story. It's not a simple tale of good versus bad. It's not a story about a generous billionaire saving a struggling housekeeper. It's a story about how money distorts everything. Not just greed, but also generosity. Not just in those who seek it, but in those who give it. When Thomas Richardson gave Vivian Hart that credit card, he didn't reveal her virtue. He revealed her wounds. When he gave Jasmine Wu that credit card, he didn't expose her as a con artist. He exposed her as a young woman trying to survive in a world that values performance over authenticity. And when he gave Elena Santos that credit card, he didn't discover that she was selfless. He discovered that she'd learned, over 54 years, that her own needs didn't matter. That her survival depended on making herself useful to people with power. That the most valuable thing she could do was disappear. The credit card test didn't reveal truth. It revealed survival mechanisms. It revealed how people without money learn to behave around people with it. It revealed the ways in which wealth creates power imbalances that no amount of generosity can actually fix. Because generosity without understanding is just another form of power. It's still you deciding who deserves help. It's still you deciding what people need. It's still you being the one with the agency and everyone else being the recipient of your choices. Thomas had to learn that the hard way. He had to sit with Elena's honesty. He had to hear her say, "I don't need to be saved. I need to be seen." He had to understand that sometimes the most generous thing you can do is nothing at all. Sometimes the most generous thing you can do is just ask. Just ask what people want. Just ask what they need. Just ask who they want to become, and then get out of the way while they become it. There's a reason I'm telling you this story. And it's not to make you feel good about generosity. It's to make you uncomfortable. It's to force you to ask yourself some difficult questions. If Thomas Richardson gave you an unlimited credit card for 48 hours, what would you do with it? More importantly, would you be ashamed to tell him? Would you buy luxury items like Vivian? Would you create a false persona like Jasmine? Would you spend it all on other people like Elena? Or would you do something that doesn't fit into any of those categories? Would you take a sabbatical? Would you invest in your own education? Would you spend time with people you love instead of buying things for them? What would your credit card statement say about who you really are when no one's watching? Because that's the real question. That's the question that matters. Not what you would buy, but what your purchases would reveal about your fears, about your wounds, about what you believe you're worth. I want you to sit with that question. I want you to sit with the discomfort of it. Because we all like to think we'd be Elena. We'd all like to believe that we'd spend the money on our families, on our communities, on causes larger than ourselves. We'd all like to believe that we're selfless and generous and fundamentally good. But the truth is more complicated. We're all Vivian and Jasmine and Elena. We're all hungry. We're all strategic. We're all trying to prove something. The only difference is what we're trying to prove, and to whom, and why we believe we have to prove it at all. Thomas Richardson learned that lesson. He learned it by giving a housekeeper an unlimited credit card, and then having the courage to sit with what it revealed about himself. He learned it by watching 3 women spend money in 3 completely different ways and realizing that none of them were wrong. They were all just human. They were all just doing their best with the resources and the psychology that they've been given. So here's my question for you, the one I want you to answer in the comments below. If Thomas Richardson gave you an unlimited credit card for 48 hours, and you knew that someone was going to analyze every purchase and judge your character based on how you spent it, how would you spend it? And more importantly, would you spend it differently if no one was watching? Would you spend it the same way if there was no judgment, if there was no test, if you weren't being evaluated? Comment below. Be honest. Be real. Tell me what your credit card statement would say about who you are. Tell me what it would reveal about your fears and your wounds and what you believe you're worth. Because sometimes the most valuable thing we can do is stop performing virtue and actually examine what we value and why, and what it costs us to prove it over and over again. If this story made you think differently about money, about power, about generosity, about what it means to truly see people and accept them as they are, hit that subscribe button. Because next week, we're diving into a story that's even more complex. The story of a woman who inherited $8 million from her estranged father. She decided to use it to win back her family. But the price she paid was higher than any inheritance could measure. She learned that some relationships can't be bought, and some bridges, once burned, can't be rebuilt with money alone. Thanks for staying with me. I'll see you in the next one. And remember, before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming stories.